I've presided over thousands of cases in my courtroom. I've seen greed dressed as grief. I've seen lies polished so carefully they almost sounded like truth. But there are a few cases that stay with you long after the cameras stop rolling, cases that crawl into your mind at night and refuse to leave. This was one of them. The moment that 95-year-old woman walked into my courtroom, the entire room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, quickly. That's how real evil usually enters a room. She didn't walk in with anger. She didn't point fingers. She didn't cry for sympathy. She shuffled in slowly, holding on to a cane with trembling fingers so thin they looked almost transparent under the courtroom lights. Every step looked painful. Her shoulders were bent. Her eyes were tired. But what disturbed me most was the fear. At 95 years old, a woman should fear illness, time, loneliness, not her own son. The bailiff helped her sit down carefully. The audience behind her whispered immediately. People always think courtroom drama starts with yelling. It doesn't. Sometimes it starts with silence so uncomfortable you can actually feel it pressing against your chest. And then her son walked in, 6'2", broad shoulders, expensive jacket, calm face, no visible emotion. That caught my attention immediately. People who are falsely accused usually carry confusion into a courtroom, nervousness, frustration, fear. But this man walked in like he was entering a business meeting, controlled, calculated, almost irritated that he had to waste his afternoon there. I remember looking at him and thinking something I've learned after decades on the bench. The dangerous ones are rarely the loudest. They're the calm ones, the ones who believe they're smarter than everyone else in the room. He sat down without looking at his mother once, not once. And I watched her carefully while he settled into his chair. She shrank the moment he entered. Her hands tightened around that cane so hard, her knuckles turned white. That told me more than any testimony could. You can fake tears. You cannot fake fear that deep. The case sounded simple on paper. Elder abuse, temporary eviction, physical assault allegation, property dispute. Son accused of slapping his 95-year-old mother during an argument, then forcing her out of her own home for 6 months. But simple cases don't end up haunting judges. Complicated people do. I asked the old woman a basic question first. Mom, where were you staying during those 6 months? Her lips trembled before she answered. In my car for some of it. The entire courtroom went dead silent. Even the audience stopped moving. I've seen hardened litigants laugh during fraud cases. I've seen people smirk during divorces. But that answer hit the room like a punch. In my car, a 95-year-old woman, sleeping in a car while her son lived comfortably inside the house she once paid for, and still she defended him. That's the part people outside courtrooms never fully understand about abuse. Victims often protect the very people destroying them, especially mothers, especially old mothers. I leaned back slightly and watched the son for a reaction. Nothing. No guilt, no shame, no sadness, only annoyance. That's when I knew this wasn't just family conflict. This was power. And power inside families becomes terrifying because it hides behind words like loyalty, obligation, respect. He finally spoke. She's exaggerating. Calm voice, flat tone, no emotion. She's sold. She gets confused. There it was, the strategy. I've seen it hundreds of times. When manipulators can't erase facts, they attack credibility, especially with elderly victims, make them seem forgetful, emotional, unstable. It's one of the ugliest legal tactics because sometimes it works. I looked directly at him. Did you slap your mother? No. Immediate answer. Too immediate. Experienced judges notice timing. Innocent people often react emotionally to accusations. Guilty people rehearse responses before the question is even finished. He crossed his arms and leaned back confidently. She fell. Now the audience stirred again, because everyone in that room had already noticed the bruise in the photograph submitted as evidence. A dark purple mark along the side of her face, the kind of bruise that tells stories mouths try to hide. I asked the old woman carefully, "Did you fall?" She looked at her son before answering. That's another thing abuse teaches people. To seek permission before speaking, even in safety, even in court, her voice barely came out. He was angry. The son laughed softly, actually laughed. I remember feeling something shift inside me at that moment. Judges are trained to remain composed. Emotion clouds judgment, but we're still human beings sitting inches away from pain all day long. And sometimes you recognize cruelty instantly because it's not in the words, it's in the enjoyment. He enjoyed controlling the room. He enjoyed interrupting her. He enjoyed watching her struggle. That's what made me uneasy. I asked him why his mother had been removed from the house. She refused to cooperate. With what? My rules. I stared at him for several seconds after that answer, not because I was shocked. Because I was studying him, people reveal themselves when they think they sound reasonable. His mother was 95 years old, frail, dependent, vulnerable, and he described caring for her like managing an employee. No warmth, no compassion, only control. Then something happened that completely changed the atmosphere in that courtroom. I asked the old woman one simple question. Why didn't you call the police sooner? Her eyes filled with tears immediately, not loud crying, the kind that hurts to watch because the person spent years trying not to cry. And then she said something I will never forget for the rest of my career. Because he's my baby. You could feel hearts breaking in that room. Even the cameraman lowered his eyes for a second. That sentence explained everything. 95 years old, bruised, homeless, terrified, and still thinking like a mother. That's the tragedy manipulative children exploit. They understand unconditional love better than anyone because they weaponize it. The son rolled his eyes while she cried, rolled his eyes. That tiny movement told me more than 10 hours of testimony. Contempt, not frustration, not exhaustion. Contempt. I began reviewing financial documents next. Property ownership records, utility payments, medical reports. And that's when the story became darker, much darker. The house had originally belonged entirely to the mother. Years earlier, she'd added her son to certain legal documents after suffering health problems. According to him, it was to help manage things, but financial transfers started appearing shortly after large withdrawals, account changes, missed medical payments. Even worse, neighbors had submitted written statements. They reported hearing arguments. Screaming, one neighbor claimed she heard the old woman crying outside late at night. Another reported seeing her sitting alone in a parked car during winter. I looked toward the son again. Still calm, too calm. That kind of calm in court usually means one of two things. Either the person is innocent, or they've convinced themselves they're untouchable. And then I noticed something else. Every time evidence appeared against him, he didn't look nervous. He looked angry at being challenged. That distinction matters enormously. Fear reacts to consequences. Ego reacts to disrespect. I've dealt with narcissistic personalities long enough to recognize the signs. The interruption patterns, the smirks, the subtle attempts to dominate conversation, the need to regain control whenever attention shifts away from them. But what worried me most was how fearless he seemed inside a courtroom. Most people become cautious in front of a judge. This man became irritated. That's dangerous because people who believe rules don't apply to them eventually test limits publicly. And that's exactly what he started doing. I asked him directly whether he forced his mother out. She left. She says you changed the locks. She's lying. She says you threatened her. She's dramatic. Every answer was cold, sharp, dismissive. Not 1 ounce of concern. Then I asked him a question that finally cracked the mask slightly. Do you love your mother? For the first time, he hesitated. Only for a second, but experienced judges notice seconds. His jaw tightened, and instead of answering the question, he attacked me. She's manipulating you too. There it was. The room froze instantly. You could feel every person in that courtroom lift their head at once. Because there's a moment during certain trials when everyone realizes the situation is no longer normal. And we had just reached that moment. I looked directly at him. Excuse me? He leaned forward slowly, calm voice, cold eyes. You judges think you know people after 10 minutes. Not nervous, not emotional, confrontational. The audience behind him shifted uneasily. Even the bailiff straightened. And then the old woman whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. He gets worse when he's angry. That sentence sent a chill through me because suddenly the courtroom wasn't just hearing about abuse anymore. We were watching the beginning of something far more dangerous unfold in real time. And I realized this man had absolutely no fear of authority, which meant one thing. He was about to do something that would shock everyone in that courtroom. The moment he leaned forward and looked at me, I knew this case had crossed a line. This was no longer only about a son who slapped his 95-year-old mother. This was about a man who had spent years controlling a fragile woman behind closed doors. And now, for the first time, that control was being challenged in public. He stared at me with those cold, steady eyes and said, "You better be careful how you talk to me." The courtroom froze. I have heard threats before. I have heard angry defendants lose control. I have heard people shout because they were scared, embarrassed, or desperate. But this was different. His voice was not loud, it was calm, and that made it far more disturbing. Because a calm threat is not an emotional accident. A calm threat is a decision. The bailiff immediately stepped closer. The spectators stopped whispering. Even the air inside that courtroom seemed to tighten. And then I looked at his mother. She was not surprised. That is what broke my heart. She did not gasp. She did not look shocked. She did not even raise her head fully. She simply lowered her eyes, gripped her cane, and became smaller in that chair. That reaction told me something no document could ever prove. This was familiar to her. She had heard that tone before. She had seen that face before. She had lived under that shadow. I looked back at him and said, "Sir, you are in my courtroom. You will not threaten this bench." He smiled. That was his biggest mistake, because in that smile, the whole courtroom saw what his mother had been living with. Not confusion, not regret, not fear. Enjoyment. He enjoyed making people uncomfortable. He enjoyed watching others hesitate. And in his mind, intimidation had worked for so long that he believed it would work even here. But a courtroom is not a kitchen where an old woman can be cornered. A courtroom is where hidden behavior comes into the light. I ordered him to sit back and remain silent while the evidence continued. He laughed under his breath. Then the evidence screen came on. At first, it showed nothing dramatic, just a dark driveway, a porch light flickering, the side of a house. The camera angle was shaky, clearly recorded by a neighbor from across the street. But sometimes the most powerful evidence is not visually perfect. Sometimes it only needs to tell the truth. On the recording, we heard the old woman's voice, small, broken, begging, "Please don't put me out. I have nowhere to go." No one in that courtroom moved. Then his voice came through. Cold, clear. "You should have thought about that before you embarrassed me." That sentence revealed motive. Not money, not confusion, not stress, pride. He believed his mother had embarrassed him, and for that he punished her. Then came the sound, a slap, sharp, sudden, cruel. His mother flinched in her seat as if it had happened again right there in front of us. That is something people do not understand about trauma. The body remembers what the mind tries to survive. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but I raised my hand and silence returned. I looked at the son. For the first time, his face changed, but not with guilt, with anger, because manipulators do not fear hurting people. They fear being exposed. I asked him, "Is that your voice?" He stared at the screen. I asked again, slower this time, "Is that your voice?" His jaw tightened. Then he said the words that turned the entire courtroom against him. She needed discipline. A gasp moved through the room. His mother covered her mouth, One woman in the audience started crying, and I sat there looking at him, realizing I was not dealing with a man who had lost control one time. I was dealing with a man who had justified cruelty so deeply that he could call abuse discipline. That is the psychology of control. First, they convince themselves they have authority over another person. Then they convince themselves that any resistance is disrespect. Then they convince themselves that punishment is deserved. And when the victim is elderly, weak, dependent, and afraid, the cruelty becomes easier to hide. But that day, it was no longer hidden. The neighbor's recording continued. We heard the old woman crying outside. We heard keys shaking. We heard him say, "You're not coming back in until you learn." The audience went silent again. 6 months. 6 months she was kept away from the only home she knew. 6 months of sleeping in her car, staying on couches, depending on strangers and neighbors, while her own son lived inside her house. And still, this woman had entered my courtroom not wanting revenge. She wanted safety. There is a difference. Revenge screams. Safety whispers. Then came the twist I did not expect. A second piece of evidence was introduced. Bank records. At first, they looked ordinary. Withdrawals, transfers, utility payments, medical bills. But then the pattern became clear. During the same period, he claimed his mother was confused. Her money was moving. Large withdrawals had been made from her account. Payments had been redirected. One insurance document had been changed. And the most disturbing part was a legal form signed months earlier, giving him control over certain financial decisions. He claimed she signed it willingly. But then her attorney presented the final document, a medical report, on the same week that paper was signed. She had been under medication after a hospital visit, disoriented, weak, recovering, not in a condition where I would trust a major legal decision without serious questions. I watched the son carefully. He was still trying to remain calm, but his fingers had started tapping against the table. That small movement mattered. For the first time, he was losing control internally, not because his mother was hurt, because his plan was being uncovered piece by piece. I asked him, "Did you arrange for this document to be signed while your mother was medically vulnerable?" He said she knew what she was doing. His mother whispered, "I don't remember signing that." He turned toward her so sharply that the bailiff stepped forward again, and that movement confirmed everything. Even in court, even in front of cameras, even in front of me, his first instinct was to silence her. I said, "Do not look at her like that again." His face hardened. Then he pointed at me. "You think this robe makes you powerful?" The courtroom went completely still. There are moments when a judge must speak not just for the law, but for every frightened person in the room. I leaned forward and told him, "No, the robe does not make me powerful. The truth does. And today, the truth is standing right in front of you." He tried to interrupt. I stopped him immediately. I held him in contempt for threatening the court. I ordered immediate protective measures for his mother. I ordered no contact unless approved by the court. I referred the assault evidence for criminal review. I ordered a financial investigation into the transfers and documents. And I made clear that any attempt to intimidate him, contact, threaten, or manipulate his mother again would have consequences far beyond this courtroom. That was when the viral moment happened. As officers moved toward him, his control finally broke. He slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "She's nothing without me!" The courtroom gasped. And his mother, this 95-year-old woman who had spent the whole day trembling, slowly lifted her head. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her voice was weak, but it carried through the entire room. "I was your mother before you became my fear." No one spoke. Not the audience, not the attorneys, not him. That sentence cut deeper than any ruling I could have delivered, because it was not just pain, it was truth. He had taken the woman who gave him life and turned himself into the thing she feared most. When he was escorted out, he was still talking, still angry, still trying to look powerful, but power had already left him. The room had seen him. That is what exposure does. It removes the costume. After he was gone, his mother stayed seated for a moment. Her hands were still trembling. Her eyes were wet. But something had changed. Her fear was still there, but now it had space to breathe. I told her, "Mom, this court believes you." She closed her eyes. Sometimes justice is not loud. Sometimes justice is an old woman finally hearing that she is not crazy, not dramatic, not a burden, not a liar. Just believed before she left. She turned toward me and whispered, "Thank you, Judge." I have heard those words many times, but that day they felt heavier because I knew she was not thanking me only for the order. She was thanking the courtroom for seeing what had been hidden for too long. That case stayed with me because it reminded me of something every family should understand. A parent's love is not a license to abuse them. Age does not make a person disposable. Weakness does not make a person worthless. And silence does not mean nothing happened. Some of the cruelest people in this world do not come shouting through the door. They come calm. They come intelligent. They come well-dressed. They come saying, "I was only helping." But truth has a way of surviving. It hides in a neighbor's recording. It hides in bank records. It hides in a mother's trembling hands. And one day, if the court listens carefully enough, truth walks into the room and speaks. That day, justice was not just a sentence. It was a 95-year-old mother walking out of court without her son's shadow standing over her. And as I watched her leave, I thought about every elderly parent sitting alone somewhere, afraid to speak because the person hurting them shares their blood. Family should be protection, not prison. Love should never require fear. And no child, no matter how grown, no matter how clever, no matter how controlled, has the right to raise a hand against the person who once held theirs.